So just I'm interested always in how someone crafts their living as a writer, translator, freelancer, how you make it happen.
Yeah, so I had always had one career path in mind from the time I was probably 18, which was to be a literature professor. And about half, 2/3 of the way through my PhD program, um, the passion for that kind of research, academic research, sort of started dropping away. I was doing a lot of meditation and stuff, and it just kind of over about 6 months a year started falling away. And then after a retreat, a meditation retreat, I realized this is not the right career path for me. So there's a little bit of a crisis there. I had never planned to be a full-time freelancer with translating, editing. It was something I did on the side. And I'd done a couple books at that point and other stuff. But anyway, I had no idea what I was going to do. I wasn't even sure if I was going to finish my PhD, which I did, thankfully. But and I was already translating and editing, so and doing some writing and stuff. So I just started amping that up and trying to see, okay, could I make it basically that way? And at one point, I unenrolled from my PhD program to try to just translate and edit and see if enough jobs would come in. At that point, I didn't even have a website or anything. It was all word of mouth. So anyway, yeah, so I unenrolled so I wouldn't have the support of the university, but I knew I could go back and re-enroll. I just had to give them like 1 semester's notice, and contractually they were obliged to give me a teaching thing until I finished. So anyway, at one point when I was unenrolled, I only had a couple months of money left. This was in Berkeley, so it was one of the more expensive places to live, the Bay Area, and more expensive places in the States, I should say. And what was funny was right then a friend had said, "Oh, hey, there's a professor, art history professor here looking for somebody to edit an Arabic translation. Could you do it?" And it was just one essay, and they paid an hourly rate, and I did that, and not realizing I was auditioning for like basically a 2-year part-time job, which was the hold on, I can show a copy of it. It's this book, Modern Art in the Arab World by MoMA, published by MoMA. So I wound up doing all the edits of all the translations, and it was French and Arabic, which was fun because I got to use the French as well. And anyway, and since then it's just taken off. And I was lucky because I had different streams. I had lived in Germany, and I had people who would send me translations from Germany or things to edit. And I've done many books there, translating from German into English. And then I had a few other streams from French, and then Arabic has kind of become the main one. And so, yeah, it just kind of worked. After I finished the PhD, I moved to less expensive places to live. I was meditating a lot, so I was mostly in India for a few years and was kind of living nomadically, which kept the cost down. It was very easy to live then because if you're getting paid in dollars or euros, really I could work. I mean, I worked more, but I could work a couple hours a week and easily pay all my bills, which were negligible. Yeah, and it just kind of, then I got a website going, and I guess for people looking to do it, I highly recommend having a website because it made it feel very much like a real business rather than just a hodgepodge of like jobs coming in and going out and whatever. So having the website also helped, and occasionally I get work through that. But and yeah, now I'm back in the States and it's going well, and happy with it, and the jobs just tend to come in at the right clip somehow. I'm not sure how it works, but it does. So, and then sometimes I'll still go to a university or something and teach some workshops for 2 days or something. Next year I'm going to Brown for a couple of days, and there's always a few other like small teaching gigs or mentorships or things like that. I was part-time faculty at the Vermont College of the Fine Arts in their translation program for a couple semesters. Some small things like that, but generally nothing that really ties me down very much.
Right. So you mentioned editing, and now mentoring and teaching, and some of that you've done with people who are translating from Arabic to English, but then some of that you've also done with people translating across in even in languages that you you don't read, right?
Yeah, that's right.
I wondered what it is that you're teaching when you're teaching to a spectrum of mentees or students who are working in maybe multiple languages. What do you convey about literary translation sort of generally?
Yeah, I guess I try to convey what the training I wish I would have had because I didn't do an MFA, I didn't do any formal certification in translation, and actually even for a lot of people who have the formal certifications, there's a specific type of training that comes with MFAs or with sort of literary translation workshops, and which I think is very different from you get certified as an interpreter or something like that.
Right.
So I convey, I think, more of the artistic side of things. So really encouraging people to not just stick to I would say a lot of the work, and most people I know who do workshops and stuff, I mean, literary translators will say this as well, including people teaching literary translation at universities, is that a lot of the work is getting people away from the very, very literal word for word translation of a text and encouraging sort of people to step back and think about translating all the other elements. So context, image, sound, those kind of things, and kind of getting away from this idea that translation is like a mirror and more about it being a kind of new creation where you, of course, when you can mirror things effectively, it's nice. But often you've got to sort of compensate for things that are lost and find your own voice a little bit. So I'd say that's the gist of it. And that's probably true for most, like I said, for most people doing that kind of work with literary translation. Is for younger translators, there's a kind of hesitancy. And I think particularly people coming out of academic programs, there's a hesitancy to really take any kind of what they perceive as liberties with the text. But for me, then you're just, if you translate a great work of poetry from Arabic, but it doesn't read as great poetry in English, but you've got like all the words right, it's to me, it's just garbage. I mean, that's the truth. I just think there's no point doing that. Or do it, but then just recognize you're just doing it for people who are looking to read the Arabic and
Have a crib, right.
Yeah, exactly. And I'm a little bit extreme maybe with that, but I guess I hate the term. People always use it. There's the domestication camp and the foreignization camp. And so my approach would be considered very much like a domestication approach. But to me, that sounds like you're taking a wild beast and like chaining it up or something.
Right.
And actually, I think it's very much the opposite. You're trying to get the spirit out and do that. And some foreignization is good, but for me, it has to be very thoughtful and very, like if I keep an Arabic word in the text, there's a pretty strong reason for it usually. That's my feeling anyway. I mean, that's how I approach it.
I mean, for me, the duality is not about domestication and foreignization. So as I was rereading some of your translations of Najwan's work, to me, I find, especially somehow in the translation of poetry, a lack of creativity in the translation process, right? It's just an attempt to mirror the words here and the words here. With your work, I found that there was an effort maybe to excavate the meaning of it, right? And so that they weren't necessarily the words and the words, but it was maybe a deeper reading where I got more out of reading the English than I went back to then I had to go back to the Arabic and say, oh yes, that was there.
Yeah.
I missed that in reading the words. And so to me, it's much more of like an engaged translation, I don't know, versus a mirror translation, or I don't know what the binary would be, but it's somehow, I put the line somewhere else.
Yeah, and working with Najwan, it's easier to do it than with maybe other texts because he's alive, right? He's contemporary, so,
right.
And then B, his English is very good, so we have a collaborative process on the translations where we go back and forth. And I mean, I think a lot of it comes down. I try to get the people I'm mentoring or leading workshops with to ask kind of, there's some questions I feel that translators don't ask. And with poetry in particular, there's one that I'm always asking, which is, does the translation sort of land or hit home, have the same force or effect or impact as the Arabic? Does it have that? Because sometimes like the last line in Arabic will work really good in Arabic, right? But if you end with that in English, it's like it kind of falls flat for one reason or another.
Right.
And so occasionally that's going to require a little bit of maneuvering to, and maybe some shifting of order or shifting of emphasis to get that same kind of force in the English, just because of the way the languages work or whatever it is. So it's often that kind of thing that's not very tangible. You can't like open up a dictionary and figure that one out. But that's the kind of thing I think I would encourage translators to ask those kind of questions more.
And for that, you need to read poetry more.
Maybe. Yeah, in both languages.
Right.
In both languages, that's the thing. I think you have to know English language poetry very well in order to translate, or at least have a feel for it. You know what I mean? Right. Have a sort of intuitive feel, but that usually comes through reading a lot. So
right. Although, so Najwan, I saw in the Words Without Borders conversation, he was saying that, and maybe he said it somewhere else too, that he wants his translator to also be a poet. Do you?
Yes.
And then he also like said that you secretly are publishing poetry.
I published a few poems, yeah, a few here and there, but yeah. It's one of the reasons I'm trying to take a bit more time off to actually write more, a little bit of my own stuff. So, because it's easy to get caught up. There's so many great projects in Arabic that have never been translated. So it's very easy to just channel all of one's creative energy into that kind of thing.
Right. And do you feel that it's easier to be creative and to move things around when you have a situation like with Najwan? You can then send him the poems and explain to him why you're doing. I mean, some of the best translations I've read recently, I know that Robin Creswell definitely worked with Min Marcel on this, and it was like a long process of back and forth, and you guys clearly have some kind of relationship of back and forth as well. I mean, what does that do for the? I can see what the possible downsides would be. Somebody who they overestimate their knowledge of the target language and they're sort of correcting you. I've seen that happen.
And that happens. Yeah.
But this also seems like a sort of, I mean, amazing sort of fortuitousness where the poet and translator can really discuss.
Yeah, it's very, I feel very lucky, fortunate to be, I mean, we're good friends also, so that helps. We have the same kind of criteria for assessing a translation or a poem, so that helps a lot too. And yeah, it just works well with him. And he's really the only author where it's kind of like a long-term relationship. You know what I mean?
Right.
We have 2 other manuscripts that are ready to go, basically, and you know, have been submitted to presses, and I imagine I will continue translating his work. So it works really well with him, and it's been kind of honed. It didn't just click like, oh, we're going to do all this stuff right from the beginning. It started very slowly, and then we met at a poetry. Well, we didn't meet. I translated his work for a poetry festival in San Francisco. I think it was 2009.
And then he didn't get the visa, right? Is that the one?
He didn't get the visa, right? But that's why I started translating his work then, and he'd already had some stuff translated by great translators, poems here and there, and but we worked well together, and so we said, okay, we'll keep doing some more stuff. And there was I thought of doing a book really, but we were publishing here and there some of the poems, and then when I was on a residency to work on a novel by Rabia Jaber at Banff.
Right. You met Jeffrey Yang.
Yes, Jeffrey Yang was there. We did a reading. We did a couple fun evenings where people read not from their Banff projects. That could be their own poetry or whoever. And so I read those translations because I was working on them. And Jeffrey Yang was there, who was editor at NYRB Poets, and he liked it, and he said, "Hey, why don't you send me a sample? Maybe we can do a book." And that was the first book, Nothing More to Lose. but that was how that one
That's
happened.
amazing, though. I mean,
All of the books have happened like that.
most translation projects are like this slog of like pitch letter, requesting a grant, pitch letter, exhausting
None
pitch
of
letter.
none of mine were like that except for the first one I worked on, which was the Adonis. And I wrote an essay about
Right, I saw that in
her
Messenger.
episodes.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was about, I mean, it took 16 years. And I'm still very proud of that translation. I really, they were co-translations.
Right.
But I felt like we did a really good job with that. But it took a long time, and it was, but most of the others have been more like Najwan's. It's been very kind of just fortuitous and synchronicity, I guess, is what some people would call it. But kind of putting yourself out there, but then being in the right place at the right time.
Right.
I don't think I had published something where I was just the one instigating it, except for that Adonis book of
Right.
all the first few projects. Since then, it's changed the last couple of years, but I'm in a different sort of place in my career now. So
right. But is part of that being in places like Banff? I mean,
yeah,
being among other. I mean, it doesn't have to be Banff. You know, Banff is amazing, but being in places among other writers, translators, publishers, editors.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, but I feel quite fortunate in that regard.
Yeah, definitely. So Najwan has also mentioned your effect on his writing. Do you feel, I mean, is there some, I mean, I don't know that he necessarily means now I write more poems about flowers because of Kareem.
No.
Yeah. But, you know, I don't know, the sort of confidence of having a partnership with a translator or somehow. I mean, how has this relationship changed things for you at all?
Well, I mean, it's just always great to be translating great poetry. I mean, I think his poetry is incredible, and I think it keeps getting better, and there's a lot of variety. Has it changed things for me? I think just working with him, because I think it's really just helped me hone some of my skills as a translator, because it's maybe the same thing he's talking about. We just have a nice dialogue, and we're really like look in depth at the text, like the translations we're working on, and the Arabic as well. And so there's kind of it's like doing a really close reading and editing with someone else. And most of the publishers don't, I mean, the editors at these presses don't have time to do that kind of super close reading. And I mean, Jeffrey Yang's a great editor. He's helped a lot. But usually it's pretty polished. I can think of maybe 1-2 poems in the last collection that required extensive edits. And I think that's because of the way Najwan and I work together, honestly. Because I've had other books like the Rabia Jabber, the Confessions. There was a big back and forth with the editor in a good way, but it was a very in-depth editorial process with that book. And then also with the first book of poetry I'm doing from French, and I think maybe part of it was translating from French, which I haven't translated a lot of French poetry. It's usually just been prose.
And that's Olivia Elias' book, or
Olivia Elias, and it's coming out in November 15th with World Poetry Books. But there were a lot of edits with that one,
right?
And there were many things that I think, I would have caught that in an Arabic text, but I didn't catch it in a French text. So a lot of things slipped through the cracks that maybe. And Olivia also hadn't worked with a lot of translators, right? So that was also part of it. So she was kind of new to the process. And I was new to the process of translating French poetry, like translating. I'd read a lot of it, but it's a different thing to try to bring it over into English. And with Arabic, you start getting, there's like just little tricks you learn, and you see certain things, and you just kind of, after 20 years, you know how to translate them.
And there are a lot of I mean, I edit a lot of texts translated from Arabic, and I don't know, a lot of things I see over and over that I consider like, repeat errors or
or where you can kind of reconstruct the Arabic based on the English the English construction, usually because it's not very natural in English. But so I think it's interesting because Najwan's books have been the ones that have required the least edits, I would say. And even like when Jeffrey Yang edited the Adonis book for New Directions, and there were more edits there, and it's funny because I haven't thought about this until you asked the question. But again, I think that's probably due to how Najwan and I work together, and the fact that we've been working together, I believe now for 13 years, if
Right.
if the
Right.
timeline is correct. I think it's been about 13 years.
Right.
So there's and 2 books have come out, but there's 2 others that are pretty much ready, and yeah, 1 more that we're slowly starting to work on. So it's not finished in Arabic yet. So
So then do you work as his agent?
for English, I guess essentially I do a little bit. I don't work with an agent. I've thought about getting an agent for my translations at different times, and maybe I still will, but up until now, I haven't felt like I really needed one. I guess the one that I'm still working on is the pre-Islamic poetry. That's the one where sometimes I felt like, oh, maybe I should get an agent for this. But even that right now, I've got 2 presses considering it, and I'm just kind of waiting, playing the waiting game. If everything fails, then maybe I will get an agent for that. But for Najwan's work, I haven't needed it yet, and it's so and with Olivia's work, we found a publisher very quickly. So Olivia Elias for that book. So after a while, you start to know a lot of people at the presses and the publishing industry and stuff. And, it's like you said, the residencies. I taught at Breadloaf this past summer, and there were, people from World Poetry Books there and other presses. And so you just meet, it's a fairly small group, I'd say. And at this point, it's also a different point in my career. If I send something, usually they'll read it, whereas 10 years ago, that may not have been the case. That wasn't really the case. They would only read it if they knew me personally, kind of thing. So, or it would go to the back of the pile, the bottom of the pile of 50 books or whatever, the projects that they're considering. So yeah, I guess now I'm in a kind of more of a privileged position with regards to editors and publishers and stuff.
It seems to me that you used to work more on prose projects, and now you're working more on poetry. Is that sort of the direction you, and still, the art writing and things, but is that the direction you want to go in, is to be focused on poetry?
I don't know. I'm not really sure what I'm going to be doing. It always depends on the projects and stuff. I do think I have more of a predilection for poetry. I don't read a lot of novels anymore these days. So it's a bit, I probably shouldn't say this, but I used to read a lot, like everything. I read philosophy. I mean, my dissertation was philosophy and poetry, and it dealt with Islamic, medieval Islamic sources, and, modern German philosophy and all this. I mean, I would read everything. And then that kind of moment when I lost the interest in academic research, it was really because I was meditating a lot, and now I don't read as much. And when I read things, they're usually books that are centered on meditation, and I spend a lot more time just kind of in silence, I guess you would say. And I still enjoy reading poetry. It's a more condensed kind of form. But one of the things that happens with meditation is the narrative voice around my own life has kind of fallen away. And the sense of this sort of, I mean, you can call it up again, but it's not there as much, where you refer back to your past achievements and the way your future life wants to be. That kind of collapses more into the present moment. And that kind of narrative arc is the basis of most novels. And so there has been a loss of interest, I would say, in that kind of form, I guess. Now, having said that, I can still enjoy a good novel from time to time and stuff. It just doesn't compel me the same way. There's a kind of different way of relating to reality in the world now, and it's less compatible with the novel as a literary form. I guess we could put it that way. Time sort of drops away, I guess. And, often I will forget a lot of stuff, like, oh, right, that's right, I've got a PhD. I did write a book. You you forget about it. You forget. I was unpacking my books the other day because I was like, oh, there's what I did publish my dissertation. I was like, wow, I forgot about it. And it's weird because, 10 years ago, I would have been jumping up and down with joy over publishing something like that. And it was still, I was very happy about it, but it's just sort of a different energy behind it now.
Right.
And more a focus on the present moment. So it's a little bit harder for me to get into the super long narrative arcs like maybe I used to.
But this sort of process of being silent also seems to me a kind of reading, maybe a kind of reading that's more akin to poetic reading.
Yeah. It's a very creative space. Silence does not mean that there's no language. I actually feel the solutions, translational solutions, come up much quicker from that space, because there is a, I don't know, you know, people always, there's a critique of Buddhism and some of the Eastern religions, and that it leads to like a kind of dull, flat peace, right? And this idea that the peace there is kind of dull and a bit lifeless. And the truth is very much the opposite, is that silent space is very much alive and vibrant with being, and it's not.
And actually, anxiety is pretty dull.
Yeah. So people think, oh, if you don't have these huge emotional spikes and dips and whatever, then it's got to be dull. But that's not actually the case. It's a very alive kind of, and anybody who goes to retreats and goes deep into that stuff will see at some point you start to see that, right? There may be periods where it feels dull, and that's in the Buddhist manuals and stuff. But those are stages that you have to work through because that's not the end goal, is not this kind of flat, lifeless, kind of nihilistic thing that
right. That's actually
people from the outside critique. Yeah. Nietzsche was famous. Nietzsche just thought Buddhism is nihilism. That's what he took certain terms without having an experiential understanding of them. And his intellectual understanding was, well, Buddhism talks about emptiness. So it's just, there's nothing there, and it's dead and lifeless and has no meaning. And,
yeah, actually, Najwan has this interesting thing about not writing poetry about something that he's not sort of fully embodied or fully committed in.
Yeah.
The poetry of tourism, and then a poetry of of something that you're fully engaged in. Do you think that matters for translation, like that you need to somehow be really like embodied in the experience, like a translation of a tourist translation versus a
well, you know, I've translated things about a lot of places that I've never been to, or that I only have a superficial knowledge of, like 2 Rabia Jaber novels set in Beirut. And I've been to Beirut, but I don't have anywhere near his level of, you know, I've spent a few weeks there, probably total, maybe a month if you add up all the visits, but that's not any kind of in-depth knowledge of the city, right? So I think I just wrote an essay on kind of this topic, trying to bring meditation and translation together. And I think of it almost in terms of like empathy, like a translation is kind of a novel, let's say a novel or a poem is a translation of certain events or feelings or intuitions from life in one way or the other. And it's coming up from something. And I think part of a really good translation is to feel into that original impulse almost before the text has become what it's become, and sort of where is that coming out of. And that's, for me, is a very like deep empathetic kind of reading. It's an empathy with the author to a certain extent, even though you may or may not be close with them. I wasn't very close with Rabia Jaber, and only ever spoke to him once. I think met him once.
He's pretty reclusive.
Yeah, and but we emailed, and he was very kind, but he didn't want that kind of relationship, and that was fine. And the books didn't require it; they just required. But at the same time, you read his books, and you know, I really got a sense of. To me, it really feels like he's channeling this stuff out, especially the pace he used to write. I don't believe he's published a new novel in many years after he got the iPath, the Arabic Booker. But I always felt he just had such a deep connection to the city and its history and its ghosts and everything. And I really felt like it was almost like he was channeling these voices. And so I tried to bring that out a little bit in those translations as much as, but that was the sense I got it. So I think it's important to have that sort of deeper connection with the text and maybe with the author, even if it might be in certain senses a fictitious one. And
Right.
so with Najwan, and I know each other very well, so I can I can see often where his poems are coming from, or I don't know, it's, like a close friend, you kind of get a sense after a while of the text still kind of surprised me, but
Mm.
not, it's still his voice, I guess you could say, that's coming through.
So you're, I think, one of the few translators, you and Yasmin Seal and maybe some other people, who translate both, who translate both 6th century, let's say, Arabic poetry and contemporary Arabic poetry. And I wondered if there is anything that the way in which those, different areas speak to. I mean, most the people I know who translate medieval or early Arabic poetry are also, scholars. And it's more likely that people translating contemporary work are also poets. But those two identities don't often go together. And I wondered how they maybe feed each other.
They feed each other. I don't know. I've always, that was just one project where I've always wanted to translate the pre-Islamic hanging poems. I don't know if I'll do tons. There's some other stuff that really calls to me from that period, like the so-called Sa'alik poetry, the kind of vagabond, the poets who existed outside the tribal system. But that's only there in fragments. There's not a lot of and there's people who consider the first Imrul Qais to be kind of both, because when his father was killed, then he essentially was outside the tribal system and lived outside the tribal system, and no longer had his father was a king, and he no longer had they call him the wandering prince, the wandering king. So there's the Wandering King was the name he was given, because when his father was killed, that was his nickname. Some of it might be legendary. We don't know how much is true. There's the famous theory that none of those poets really existed, which I think is a bit extreme. But one thing that's interesting, because I think probably Imrul Qais is my favorite of all of those. There's others that I like a lot. Najwan has talked. We've done a couple of interviews and events lately, and he's talked about how Imrul Qais is like very, very important to him, which is interesting. Their voices are totally different, but that part is interesting. So I know, I just feel like there's those old texts that really need like a strong poetic translation, and maybe there's a bit less now, because I think the Library of Arabic Literature is doing really good work, and they're not. I don't feel like they're sacrificing literary quality for the sake of scholarship. I haven't read all the books in the series, but what I've seen, and I think Yasmin, for example, Yasmin Seal isn't she doing?
She's doing several books for them now, I think.
Yeah. So there's an example of somebody who's certainly going to produce. I mean, she's one of my favorite contemporary translators of Arabic literature, and she's not going to sacrifice any literature. I mean, the texts, I'm sure, are going to be sparkling in terms of their poetry. And those projects are a harder sell. I've still had, I'm still kind of trying to get the pre-Islamic hanging poems a home. And finally, I just said, you know what, I was kind of saving Imrul Qais and just publishing little bits here and there. And I'm going to publish the whole thing with Poetry London, just so it's there in one place rather than fragments here and there. But then there's also the question, like, so for example, that poem, which as one of them, Imrul Qais's Mu'allaka, his hanging poem, I read it as, there are certain parts of the poem that are very clearly from when he was a prince, and there are other parts of the poem when essentially he became a vagabond in the desert, right? And there's maybe one part at the end where you're not 100% sure. I'd have to do a closer reading of that, but could be either. But they're not sequential in order, the way that people have put it together. So the beginning is clearly from where he's a prince, and then there's a couple spots. There's a part about the wolf and a few things where that are from clearly when he was a vagabond, and then there's a long section about the horse after that from when he was a prince again, like almost certainly. And then the end could be either. So those kind of, like, it's such a canonical text, but can I change the order? That's a huge leap, especially if they haven't had a big translation in English in book form yet.
Right.
You know,
Right.
so
With the
those kind
Odyssey,
of questions,
Odyssey
right?
maybe you feel more flexible because there are so many different versions of it
Yeah,
available easily to somebody.
yeah,
Whereas this, yeah, there have been a number of translations, but that doesn't mean they're available or accessible.
yeah, exactly. And you know that I saw Robin Cresswell had a really nice translation in Poetry Magazine of the whole Mu'allaqah, but it's a very different approach to mine as well, and it's more, the lines are more, there's a form to it, I would say.
Right. I like what he did with the line breaks.
Yes, I do too, and but it's very different from what I was doing, and mine has just kind of gone way off. Like, I'm really trying to capture that exuberance. I think that's the spirit of Imrul Case for me, even though there's a measured meter and everything. Um, and so there's just different approaches. But again, how much freedom can you take when there's hasn't been, like you said, a bunch of translations, like with the Odyssey or the Iliad or whatever it is. And so I'm still not sure, and I don't, those questions, those will get answered whenever I get the contract and I relaunch myself into the project. So
Right.
we'll see.
Right. And yeah, it depends also how much the publisher wants to,
Yeah,
involved in that as well.
yeah, exactly. So I mean, if you're doing it with like Library of Arabic Literature, you wouldn't change it, but perhaps for a different publisher, maybe you would, and you flag it with a note.
Right.
You know, that's another way to do it. So, or you just leave it and let the reader figure it out. That's another. But the it's very possible that those things got shifted when it was passed down, and it's very, you know what I mean, and almost certainly a lot of it changed anyway. You know, it's very unlikely that the Imrul Case we have is what the historical figure of Imrul Case
Right.
actually sang, but who knows? So.
Right. So I'm interested in your thoughts from a sort of non-narrative point of view on the role of prizes in the literary ecosystem, because they seem very, I don't know, prizes seem very, very much about an arc.
Yes.
So a number of your translations have either been shortlisted for or won prizes, particularly recently, particularly Najwan's work. And I just wanted to know how you viewed prizes, both in your own work and just in the literary ecosystem more generally.
So I think they're important. I'll say that first. And I'm always happy if there's any recognition, whether it's a long list and I've been a judge for a few things. And so I know, you know, it's a lot of books you got to read, and it's not easy to make the decisions, and you often have conflicting among the judges, conflicting opinions of what should be considered and what shouldn't, and these kind of things. So I think they can definitely raise the profile of a book. I'm very happy with the way it's worked out with Exhausted on the Cross, with Najwan's last book, because to be shortlisted for 4 prizes, one of which was not limited to translations, which was nice to see, and then to win one of them, and a very, obviously very nice one to win. It, you know, when you get shortlisted for one or you win one, sometimes you think, well, you know, it could just be the subjective opinions of the judges, and it is that. But when I've never had 4, and for me, it kind of justified. I made some bolder translational choices with that work. So, just to speak in specifics, in this instance, the prizes for me really kind of gave me extra confirmation. Like, yes, trust your instincts. If you feel strongly about, you know, shifting something, do it, right? And so that was good. I think just kind of confirmation for me, like, you can keep trusting your instincts there, and that kind of thing. And also with which projects to pick, because, you know, there's ultimately it's my choice as a translator. I don't have to translate all of Najwan's books. You know, it's and that was the one that kind of pulled us in. He had other books that he'd completed before, and we both kind of gravitated towards that one. So so that's good. Obviously, you want your work to reach as many people as possible. I would say this book has been the first one where I've been actively involved in the publicity. And so that was the other thing, was I put energy into publicizing the book, which I really had never done before. Not much anyway. Generally, my approach was someone writes me and asks to do a reading or something like that, I'll do it. But it was very laissez-faire.
Right.
And generally the publishers don't have a lot of time to arrange a whole bunch of stuff. So if the publisher's not doing it and the translator's not doing it, then nobody's doing it. And that happened with the Rabia Jabber. It got the second Rabia Jabber was a finalist for PEN America, and it won the PEN Center USA, which has since been folded into PEN America. But not many people read it.
Right.
And that was partially on me. I did not put any energy out there into doing it. Rabia didn't put any energy
Right.
out there.
No.
And the publisher was very busy, and they don't have a lot of resources for publicity, and they have to kind of pick and choose where they put them.
Sure.
So with this book, I said, you know what, I'm going to take one book. I really love this project. I'm going to take it. I'm going to make an effort. I'm going to submit poems to places. I'm going to be thoughtful about that. I'm going to do readings. I'm going to reach out to people, ask them for reviews, ask them for blurbs. And what was interesting was also the publicity person, Abigail Dunn, who's wonderful at NYRB Poets. I think because I was doing stuff, her energy level also, we kind of fed off each other. She arranged a couple of things, I arranged a couple of things. And, it may sound a little bit new agey or something like that, but I actually feel like the energy we put into that is now kind of germinating with these short lists and with the Sarah McGuire Prize. Somehow it came through, I think. So the prizes also for me are kind of confirmation a little bit about that. I think, you get what you put into something is largely what you're gonna get out of it. And I definitely put a lot more energy into the publicity around this book than I did I even interviewed Najwan for Words Without Borders,
Yeah.
So, but that comes about through writing them and saying, hey, what can we do? Is there anything we can do with this book? And then those things come out like that.
That's right? A lot of effort. I mean, you can't possibly do that with every project.
No, but I really love this project, and I had a lot of energy. It was also kind of circumstantial. I had a lot of energy at that point in time, and now I feel like I'm kind of on a slightly, I'm taking projects away and trying. I was kind of on an upward arc in terms of what I was taking on and stuff. And now, for a little while, I might be on a downward arc, and then it'll hopefully pop up again. But so yeah, I think they're very important, particularly with translations. It's difficult to get people. They don't sell tons of copies, translations, so most of them anyway. So it's always good to have this kind of recognition for projects, and it definitely helps them out. And it's also just, it's nice to know that it's always a bit weird reading your own work. And it's weird because with Najwan's books in particular, I don't know why, I'll always do a first draft, second draft, and I'm never satisfied. I always think, this is the book that's just not going to work at all now. And somehow with the final draft, when we really got it, then suddenly it's like I see it with fresh eyes. I'm like, no, wait, actually, this is pretty good. And it happened with Exhausted on the Cross as well. And it's happened with these other books that we're working on. And it's just interesting. So it's nice to know that final, actually, I think this is a good book now in English. It's nice to know that other people think that too, I guess, because it's all very subjective. And it's always surprises me because I always have my favorite poems from the book, and the ones that I just think, it's a middling, it just didn't come out very well in English. And often those ones, so I just have this kind of, it happens every time, but I kind of have this assumption that my favorite poems are going to be everyone else's favorite poems, and they're not. And there's often those other ones, there's some poems in that book that I really had to go back and read because, people are discussing it on Twitter or whatever. And I was very surprised, oh, that one, really? I better go back and look at that one again. Yeah, sorry, it's a long answer to a short question.
No. So we've been talking a long time, but I want to just ask one last question about your translations being translated onward into other languages.
Yeah.
And I imagine with Najwan's poetry, that's been one where it has been the bridge in the middle into whatever, Chinese, Spanish, Albanian, Romanian, Croatian, I don't what all the other ones. And whether you ever work with those other do they ask you things about how to say, or you just see them appear in these other languages?
I see them appear, and sometimes I don't see them appear. Often I don't. Just, but no, I mean, English is a bridge language, particularly for the smaller ones.
Right.
Smaller languages are languages with fewer Arabic translators. So a lot of, I mean, Italian, they haven't used the English to my knowledge. They may consult.
They shouldn't. I mean, there's lots of great. Arabic to Italian.
I do think some of those translators will consult in the same way. When I was doing Adonis, because it was so hard, I was consulting the French translation, the German translation, and the Spanish translation to try to just see how did people interpret these poems. But that was maybe an extreme case with Adonis. There's a lot of ambiguity and a lot of it's a different style of poetry than Najwan's. So no, the short answer is none of those translators have ever contacted me, to my recollection anyway. But it's nice to see it every now and then. Let me see if I have one somewhere on my shelf. Oh yeah, here it is. I think it's the Macedonian. Every now and then I'll get a book. Let me see what language it is. I'll say Macedonian. It is Macedonian. So this was a bilingual Macedonian English of nothing more to lose.
Okay.
Right? So
Not trilingual, for instance.
Not trilingual, no, because I guess I don't know very much about Macedonia, but I guess there's not many people in Macedonia who read Arabic. I'm not sure. Presumably more read English, which may be why they did it. But so that's kind of cool to see, because the English is my translations.
Right.
And then hopefully, wait, can you hold up are you translated on the cover?
No, I don't think I'm credited. Hopefully I'm credited somewhere in the book. I didn't even check. I may not be, actually. I have no idea. I think, no, there's my name in Macedonian. Okay, so they did credit me actually right on the title page, which is nice. I'm pretty sure that's Kareem James Abu-Zeid. There's a hyphen there. On the, I don't know if you can see
I can't see it, but
anyway,
they
credited me. They gave me equal credit with the Macedonian translator in Macedonian. So I'm glad you asked that, because I had never looked for that before. But yeah, so that stuff is nice, and it's nice to be the bridge. And it's probably good that, since the English translations are kind of the bridge, it's really good that Najwan and I work more collaboratively with it.
Right. And also that you're focused on creating something that works as poetry. I can just imagine some situations where English works as a bridge, where it's the Arabic, and then it's sort of this flattened mirror translation, and then it's a translation of this flattened mirror translation, and by the time you get to the third language, what do you read?
Yeah, exactly. So I mean, I think again, I feel quite lucky. It's just nice I didn't set out to become his translator and or anything like that. And he had another book in English that came out in the UK called Embrace.
Right. Yes, I saw that with the Translation Center.
Yeah, and so I'm supportive of that kind of stuff. I think that's good. I think a good poet should have many translators, but it's also nice to have sort of, one. I haven't done more than 2 books by any other author, right? 2, for whatever reason, has always been the stopping point.
Right.
And with this one now, we've got 4, and the 5th one kind of on the way, even though only 2 have been published so far. It takes a little while to get things published. So it's kind of nice to have one author where it's a different. I'm realizing now, it does kind of change things. It's like a longer relationship. You kind of go a lot deeper with some things than you can in other ways, and with shorter projects. So.
Right. Great. Okay. Thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it.